Hello, hello, and welcome again to a Beatles program called Things We Said Today. This is a weekly talk show podcast in which we talk about anything and everything Beatles, any part of their past, the present, sometimes the future, whatever we feel like talking about in the moment. And I'm Ken Michaels, one of the four regular co-hosts of the show, also known for my other Beatles program, a syndicated radio show called Every Little Thing. And I'm being joined by my three other regulars. First of all, the writer for Beatles Examiner, the number one primo news source on the internet for Beatle fans, that being Steve Marinucci. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Ken. Hello, everyone.
And we also have the senior editor for Beatle Fan Magazine, who's been with them many, many years since its inception, as a matter of fact, that being Al Sussman. Hi, Al.
Hi, Ken. Hello there, everybody.
Also, another writer for Beatle Fan and for many music publications, we have got Allan Kozin. Hi, Allan.
Hey, Ken. Hello, everyone. And let me click my mouse for my mouse friends here.
Oh, my.
Is this going to be an ongoing thing now?
Well, I haven't mentioned Life with the Lions in a while, so I needed a new sort of something.
No, you haven't.
Right. And now I've got them both into one show. All
right. Whatever turns you on at the moment, Allan.
We need to have a Life with the Lions show.
That's coming at some point.
Okay.
Anyway, on today's show, most of our conversation is going to be about the Wings Over America tour because as we speak, we are celebrating its 40th anniversary in America. And so we'll be talking about that. And having a bit of a conversation concerning an interview that Paul just did recently on BBC television. And we'll talk about that, we'll mix that into the conversation. Before we do that, I just wanted to address one email that we got sent from David Goldsmith. And David lives in Auckland, New Zealand. And he just wanted to respond. We love New Zealand. Very strong Beatles fan base there. So he wanted to respond to the Bob Dylan influenced, the Beatles and Bob Dylan influence show. We mixed that also with the Beach Boys and Pet Sounds. And I was bringing up, because I couldn't remember what recording Bob Dylan released in which he's singing part of I Want to Be Your Man. And so David let us know it is called I Want to Be Your Lover, which is a 1965 outtake with the Hawks that he first released on Biograph in 1985. And he says now it's in multiple iterations on the big blue box set, which Allan mentions that he owns.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay. So along with that, David also wanted to thank, is actually me, for mentioning the Finn brothers as artists that I'd like to see Paul McCartney work with. We know the Finn brothers from their work with Split Enz and Crowded House, and apparently the Finn brothers are considered very iconic figures. And according to David Goldsmith, this is in New Zealand, there's always comparisons made with Lennon and McCartney, with Neil and Tim. So David, just want to thank you for writing to us, and we always encourage our listeners to write to us for anything. If you want to respond to one of our previous shows or have an idea for an upcoming show, feel free to write to us. So thank you, David. So our main topic is the Wings Over America tour, which, as I said, happened 40 years ago, and was one of the first concerts I ever attended. And I got to see Wings at Madison Square Garden, and still to this day, I consider it my favorite concert of all the concerts I've ever been to. Second time I ever saw a Beatle, because I saw George in '74. But it was a magical time back then. And sometimes when I think about that tour, I can't help but think about everything that surrounded it. And by that, I mean the radio airplay that McCartney was getting at the time with Wings. I mean, radio was saturated with Wings at that time on both AM and FM. So I think very fondly back to that time. And especially Al in particular, because, you know, you're in the New York metro area. You remember just as well as I do the kind of airplay that Paul was getting, not only with the singles, with Silly Love Songs and Let 'Em In, but Wings at the Speed of Sound was the #1 album around the time of the tour.
Right.
And so many other album tracks were being played by Wings, and that had been a buildup the previous years from, say, Band on the Run. Actually, Red Rose Speedway was the #1 album, but Band on the Run had several tracks played on the radio on both AM and FM as rock radio was developing. And same thing with Venus and Mars. And then that kind of culminated with Wings at the Speed of Sound, because I always remember so well, we had our rock station in New York at the time of WPLJ, which also played a lot of pop stuff too, mixed it together. But they would play a lot of album cuts like Time to Hide on the radio, Denny Lane's song. And they played She's My Baby and Beware My Love and Wino Junko and those songs. So that particular album got heavy airplay with so many different tracks, and it was a great time for Paul McCartney. It was at the, some people might call it the zenith of his career, certainly in terms of popularity, in terms of radio airplay, and depending on whether you consider Wings the #1 tour of the year. I'm not sure if Peter Frampton did better than Paul. I'm not quite sure. I certainly know Frampton Comes Alive was a blockbuster album. But, the Wings Over America tour was huge. And I loved seeing that show, and I missed the whole concept of Wings. And I also remember so well that, there was a running joke at the time. Did you know Paul McCartney was in a band before Wings? And that's all because Wings was so popular, and it wasn't just the McCartney tracks, as I mentioned. So you had Denny Lane songs, you had Jimmy McCulloch songs being played on the radio, and I remember all that at the same time as this tour. And then there's the performance of the tour, which I thought was amazing, and every time I look back on it and watch Rock Show, I'm just, I wish I could go back to that time. It's one of the few moments when I can actually say that, because the performance of the band, they were really on fire when I look back at that particular tour. But I'm going to get my comments from each of you, and why don't we start with you, Al?
It was like a victory lap for Paul, because, of course, he took a lot of flack in the early 70s because of his perceived role in the Beatles breakup, and also because he took the rap, especially because of Ram, and perhaps even more so Wildlife, as being this lightweight, this lightweight pop star. And indeed, when the tour, as the tour was getting underway, Silly Love Songs, which was his answer to those very critics, became the #1 song in the U.S. And that harder rocking version of Silly Love Songs that they did on Wings Over America was, that was, if you want to call it a victory lap, you can very well do that. It was actually my first time seeing a Beatle, because I never saw the Beatles live. I didn't see the concert for Bangladesh, or the shows on the Dark Horse tour, or the 1-to-1 concert. So this was my first shot at seeing a Beatle. And I saw the show 3 nights before you did, Ken. I saw the show at the Nassau Coliseum, out in your old stomping grounds in Long Island, and it was absolutely, it's one of the most amazing concerts to this day that I've ever seen. And it was it was really an emotional charge, along with the fact that it was just a great rock and roll show. A great arena concert. It was, there was also that emotional element of seeing a Beatle for the first time, especially when they did the acoustic set. Which was, in those days, that was kind of like a standard part of the rock concert, was the kind of the mid concert acoustic set, what Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young called the wooden set, when they had their tour in 1970. And when Paul ended that set with Yesterday, I swear, well, if you've seen either Rock Show or Wings Over the World, you can see the shots of people in the audience with tears streaming down their faces. And it took me all through You Gave Me the Answer, which was the first song when Paul went back to the piano for the first song of the second half of the show. It took me all of that song to kind of get myself back together. That's how much of an emotional charge that concert, that particular moment gave me. And it is it's got to be still among probably my top 5 concerts of all time.
What did you think of Wings as a band? Did you think it really worked as a band, or did you go there thinking this is Paul McCartney and 4 other people?
It's, they obviously, because of the fact that especially on Venus and Mars and on Wings at the Speed of Sound, Paul went to great lengths to basically emphasize the band aspect of it, with Denny getting vocals and Jimmy McCullough getting his own songs, and even Joe English doing Must Do Something About It.
Right.
On Wings at the Speed of Sound. So I knew that he was basically really trying to emphasize that it was a band, but still, it was really, the 90% of the people that were there were going to see Paul McCartney. They weren't going to see Wings. If you kind of get my drift there.
I get your drift. When I listen to the albums, I think of them more as a band, especially when you're dealing with an album like Wings at the Speed of Sound, because you have every single member of the group doing a lead vocal there. And how many bands can you say that about? Outside of the Beatles. And granted, he let Linda have Cook of the House there, but all the other members did a fine job with their songs. They held their own, and in particular, you mentioned Must Do Something About It, which is a real highlight for me.
Sure.
On Wings at the Speed of Sound, Joe English has a great singing voice, and I kind of wish that particular lineup, had continued, because if they had done anything with the same format for the next album, instead of Jimmy and Joe leaving, it would have been pretty interesting to see if he had kept up that same kind of idea and really let each person in the group have their moment, at least one song per album. But how about you, Allan? What do you think of that tour, and where did you see Paul?
I didn't actually go that year.
Really?
Yeah, I think when he was in the New York area, I was still up in Syracuse where I went to school, and I don't think he'd gotten near there. But, okay, so I had already seen a couple of Beatles because I'd been to the concert for Bangladesh. And for me, this era of Wings was more of maybe, I don't see it as much as a victory lap as a kind of rehabilitation, because of, what Al said about Paul taking a lot of hits in the early 70s. I mean, I didn't really like a lot of his early 70s stuff, and my listening was going off in different directions, and at the time, and but he was beginning to put out some good stuff. I didn't like Silly Love Songs much either, but apart from that, I liked a lot of what he was doing, and it did interest me that, I sort of caught up with some of the stuff that was going on in the New York area through tapes that people had. WNEW had a backstage interview with him at the Garden, and so all of those things started circulating around pretty quickly afterwards, and so I got my hands on those and got to hear a bit of what was going on, and you saw things on TV, and but it really wasn't until the album came out and then later Rock Show that I was able to really catch up with a sense of what that experience was like. Although hearing you two talk about it, it obviously pales in comparison to actually being there seeing it. Yeah. But when I saw them, when I saw Rock Show, I kind of thought, I kind of wish I had been at that, because he really did cover a lot of what Wings' highlights had been up to that point, and a few Beatles songs, and It looked to me like a pretty tight band, although the whole question of whether Wings was a band was really a little confusing, and still is in a way. I mean, you have a band with a name. When you have a band with a name, you kind of think, okay, it's a band, it's Wings. It's not just Paul McCartney, it's Wings. And it had some personnel changes, and obviously Paul was going to be the focal point. I mean, there was no way he couldn't be, even if he did get a super group together. There's the question of Beatleness.
Exactly.
Well, I wanted to just let me counter that.
Okay.
Because George Harrison was able to do it with the Traveling Wilburys. I mean, nobody would ever say that was George's group, even though he was a Beatle. You had 5 established superstars going into a band.
Okay.
Paul didn't do that. So, if you got much lesser known musicians, granted a lot of people, I'm sure, knew Denny Lane, still no matter what, Paul's going to be the kingpin.
Okay, so you got all those really great people in the Wilburys, but where do you file those albums? Mine are filed with George.
Mm-hmm.
So, I don't know. Okay.
But I think the Wilburys are a different situation because of who. I mean, you didn't have anybody, honestly, in Wings that ranked up with Dylan and Orbison, and
right.
So
that's what I'm saying.
Right, because there was plus there was in the case of the Wilburys, there was a personal connection there because of the fact that all of the other guys in the group were friends of George's.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how many superstars of the time, quote unquote, were close enough to Paul.
Yeah, well, listen, Kanye wasn't even probably born yet, so what can we say?
This is true.
But
I mean, he did talk in that Mastertapes interview that just came out about, he had thought about contacting superstars, but I mean,
yeah,
that wouldn't have. I mean, it wouldn't have worked on. I mean, basically, what he wanted is a showcase, and that's what Wings.
Well, but
really
he also
was.
see this is part of the confusing thing, because he also says he wanted a band. He wanted a band to go back to the start and play at universities, and and all of that, and yet it still was going to be Paul McCartney and a bunch of other guys. I mean, the early Wings lineup, he was like, paying them a very low weekly wage. I just listened to an interview with Denny Sywell where, he talks about how, actually he had been making about 10 times what Paul paid him as a studio musician in New York. I mean, it obviously was interesting to him to put that aside and go work with Paul and see what happens. But, it wasn't, it wasn't like a band of equals, which is what a band more or less is, what we think of a band.
Well, there's more when you're talking about a band. There's more to it than how everyone gets paid. If you're talking about in a creative capacity, if you go back to the earliest years of Wings and the early tours, Denny Lane still got to sing "Say You Don't Mind."
Okay.
Henry McCulloch got to do one of his instrumentals. It wasn't like it was always Paul with everything. And I have interviewed most of the members of Wings, and they all have their own stories to tell.
Right.
But in
of
general,
course they do.
And
but
one of Henry McCulloch's was that he didn't like being always told what to play, and in a band there's more give and take. I mean, So I don't know. I think of them as a band when I listen to Wings Over America. I mean, it sounds like a band, but then his current band sounds like a band too. But they don't really make any pretense of that being a band with
exactly.
Right.
And those are to me. I mean, those are great musicians. His current band. There are people who have some problems with one or the other of them, but I mean, I think those guys can play anything in Paul's catalog at the drop of a dime, and I think it's very impressive. Wings, by comparison to the current group, I think was maybe a little bit ramshackle, but it was also a more ramshackle time, I mean, it was the 70s.
Exactly.
I mean, we're now in a very high-tech touring situation, whereas, in Wings, I mean, they were they were maybe a light year or two ahead of the Beatles in terms of touring facilities. Can you imagine the Beatles trying to do "Live and Let Die" with a piano blowing up and the whole thing? I mean,
Mhm.
And also, the McCartney tour now is charging a little more than
yeah, that's
than
true.
what.
Well, they're
did
charging
back
a lot
then.
more.
Well, yeah, I was kind of being
Yes, actually, they're
But-
charging about 4 times what each individual Wings member made per week in the
was
first
big.
lineup per ticket. So yeah,
There we
But
go.
there's a lot of differences though between the Wings lineups and the current band.
sure.
I mean, the current band really is basically his band for live shows, and if Paul feels like it, they could be on his studio albums.
Mhm.
But with
And they have-
Wings, whatever lineup you had on those albums, that's the band that went out on the road at the time.
Right,
So at least you have that to say.
right.
And I just I respect the current band that he has and has had for the past 15 years or so.
Mhm.
But there is a huge difference there between them and Wings.
Yeah.
And I do very seriously feel that Paul made a concerted effort for Wings to be looked at as a band.
Mhm.
Because if you go back to that time, and it's even in the DVD for the deluxe Wings at the Speed of Sound, there's an interview there with all the members.
Mhm.
They all get a little bit of time. Something like that doesn't just happen. That's kind of planned and calculated. So,
but
for that to happen, that means that Paul wanted Wings to be presented that way. I don't think that it was strictly a showcase for Paul's music.
But again, that was a different time. That would not happen today because of the focus. Because number one, Paul McCartney is a lot bigger now than he was then.
Well, no,
Yeah,
no,
we're
no,
talking,
no, no.
Well, we're talking about how it was then and what Paul was trying to do then.
But
He's not bigger now. He was bigger then. He had the #1 single and album in the country this week 40 years ago. He doesn't have the #1 single and album now.
No, but I think his status,
he makes a lot of money as a concert act, but he's not a big act in the way that some of the younger acts are. But at that moment in time 40 years ago, he was he and Wings were huge.
Mm-hmm.
I disagree on the status of McCartney then versus McCartney now, because I agree that Wings
Well,
were huge.
he hasn't had a hit record, and he hasn't had a hit single, a top 10 hit single, in 30 years.
No, I
He
agree.
has-
Not
he-
true.
I understand that, but I'm saying his status in the music world, I think, is even though he hasn't had the hits, the fact that he's a Beatle, the fact that he's
Well, yeah, but that's that.
introduced in
Yeah,
that
but-
BBC interview as the greatest songwriter of all time, which you can argue about. But I think there's more. I think his status is a lot. I mean, he wasn't Sir Paul McCartney back then. He is now. I mean, I think there's some big differences between then and now, and so
It's two different things there. It's whether or
Yeah.
not you're at the top of your popularity commercially, which is
Right.
what Paul was really throughout, most of the 70s, and
Mhm.
even into the early 80s, he was still doing extremely well with his records and his singles. But, as time goes on, he becomes more and more of an iconic figure because of who he is. You just get
Venerable.
bigger and bigger through time.
Yeah.
And another big difference is that back then, he wasn't relying on the Beatles catalog to carry him in these shows. He only did
Right.
5 Beatles songs in the entire set list.
And that was a
Nowadays,
concession.
yeah, and now it's more like 60% of his catalog is Beatles, and that's another issue that we'll get to. But the difference is back then he was selling his current catalog and his recent catalog. Today,
Mhm.
Paul McCartney is selling Paul McCartney
Yeah.
and the name.
Well, that's true too. And it's actually funny if you watch Rock Show how casually he does Yesterday, whereas now he's not really. I mean, what he does Yesterday now, he's very serious. I mean, but he kind of slept through it, on Rock Show.
Well, actually, now he kind of goes. He kind of does Yesterday now as if he's on autopilot. In fact, he's even said that probably that, if he was able to, he might want to retire certain songs, and probably Yesterday is one of them, because he's just done them so many times now. But back then it was like, it was actually, on that tour, that was the first time he had performed that song since the 66 Beatles tour. Or, well, no, and also the James Paul McCartney special.
Some of the introductions are just extremely casual. It's like, okay, you can tap dance to this one now, or something, something like that.
Oh, well, that's a difference, because I was thinking of that, because he in those, and of course, actually in those days, that was the way rock concerts were. Acts generally didn't really talk that much, other than, say, Bruce Springsteen or somebody like that. And he actually, exactly. And Paul really talked very little during most of those shows. It was basically, like, how you doing, or like you say, and you can, shake your bum to this one, that sort of thing. It didn't do all the stuff that he does, if you want to call it that, if you want to call it shtick that he does now, with taking off the coat and let me soak in all of this, and tell the Jimi Hendrix story, and all of that. So it's very different.
Although, speaking of that, I listened to the deluxe box set this weekend, and the San Francisco stuff, which I really enjoyed. Wish he would put out more archival stuff. And at the very beginning of that, he welcomes the audience to San Francisco, and I'm thinking, wait a minute. Those people already were in San Francisco. He's just getting to San Francisco. So I just thought that was a lot. Yeah. But yeah, you're right. He doesn't talk that much. I mean, he talks about the rhythm box and, a little. I hadn't actually missed the talking, even though he talks a lot more now. I mean, there's a little bit of interaction. Maybe it's because, as you say, that's how shows were, and it just seemed natural to me. But
But just to go a little bit further on what I was just saying about when Paul tours now, he's basically selling Paul McCartney and a word that you love very dearly, Steve, the brand. One thing that you and I have talked about, Steve, before Allan joined the show, and this is something that is not just with Paul and with Ringo, but it's common nowadays with a lot of acts that go out on tour. You can't buy their CD at the show. You can't buy Paul McCartney's New at one of his shows. You can't buy Ringo's Postcards from Paradise. They're not necessarily selling their new CD, even though they're playing something from it. But you can buy T-shirts, and you can buy keychains, and you can buy hoodies. There's more money in that, and that's what they're selling there. They're not necessarily, selling their latest album, even if they're playing something from it. That's not the main purpose why you're going to see them now. You're going to see a legend and songs spanning their entire careers. So back then, Paul had something to prove back then to build himself up like he did gradually. The album started to sell more and more and more. And from Red Rose Speedway, which went to #1, through Wings Over America, all those albums, Band on the Run, Venus and Mars, Speed of Sound, Wings Over America, they all hit #1. It was this gradual climb. So it was just great to witness that. And, apart from that, the show itself was an amazing show.
Interestingly enough, Brian, he was allowing Brian to sell his CDs on past tours, but I did not see his CDs this time. So that's interesting.
Brian Ray, you're talking about.
Brian Ray, yeah.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And I do recall when you and I talked about this, Steve, a lot of the songs from, say, Band on the Run through Speed of Sound worked so much better as live performances than studio recordings. Yeah. So I think for that reason, that's one of the reasons why that tour worked so well. Still to this day, my favorite recordings of certain songs like Letting Go, that it's a live version you got to listen to more so than the studio. Not that I don't love the studio, but
I really, I thought I watched Rock Show again, and I think that tour is great. I do, but as we've been saying, it was kind of a haphazard thing. I mean, it's kind of thrown together, and I actually did some comparisons, and I was going to throw a question out to you guys: do you think Wings Over America is his best tour?
Yes.
Allan?
Gosh, it's hard to say. I mean, it has that cachet of, first of all, being really the biggest Wings tour, and a live album came from it, and there's all of that. But I don't know. I think the tours he did in between '89 and maybe 2005.
New World
2005 was
Tour.
beginning to. Yeah, '93 was really good. Yeah, I don't know. I think some of those tours may have been better in terms of the playing and the set list, but I don't know. But the Wings Over America it sort of stands by itself in a way.
No, and I agree. It does. I was one of my favorites, though. Believe it or not, is Space Within Us. That is that DVD, especially the Blu-ray version, which is really an incredible, really stunning, and it sounds fantastic. And one of the songs that really caught my, I reviewed. I kind of scanned through both of them, to prepare for this. And one of the songs that blew me over that would be great for him to do again would be Flaming Pie. That really sounded good on Space Within Us. I couldn't believe it.
Except he did that. He did that for a long time.
Yeah.
Right. The way it starts, and especially the sound mix on that DVD is wonderful. And I don't know if it's just the Blu-ray, but the Blu-ray is the picture is so good, and the sound mix on that thing is great. And I've recommended that before as probably one of my favorite. A couple of years ago, I think I said that was my favorite Beatles Blu-ray. I mean, we've had a couple since then, but that one is just fantastic. It really is.
Hey, Steve, you said that the Wings Over America tour you called haphazard. I'd like for you to explain that.
What?
Oh boy,
I didn't want that to go unnoticed here.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it was the way. I mean, the way things were back then. It wasn't as organized as it was. I mean, it was as we know, it was very much a family affair. There seemed to be somewhat of a casual spirit to it all.
Yeah, but that was the 70s. It was right. It wasn't as everything wasn't as corporate as it is now. With 8 million sponsors and all that sort of thing.
Came from is that. I mean, it's actually hard to believe that Paul McCartney could do a tour like that, especially in light of what the way his tours are now. I mean, I said, watching Brian Ray and Rusty and everybody, on some of the recent tours has been fantastic. I mean, they're a wonderful band, and but I mean, it's amazing the evolution that he's gone through as far as touring goes.
But that like Wings Over America was hardly haphazard. I mean that was really the culmination of a whole really what began with the. If you want to call the kind of the bus tour that they did in '72 in Europe, that was a little haphazard, but by '76, I
really meant more somewhat casual.
Yeah, that was really more of a an operation. Much more of an operation. It wasn't as corporate as things are now, but it was. I mean, watch Wings Over the World, and you can see how big an enterprise that really was in '76, and it was and exactly, that the timing could not have been more perfect. Because it was really just as he had completely kind of rehabilitated his popularity. Mm-hmm. And as a matter of fact, this week, probably as, somewhat of a reaction to the success of Wings Over America, Capitol released Got to Get You Into My Life. as an advanced single from the Rock and Roll Music compilation, and that became a top 10 record.
That's right.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, the Wings Over America tour is very organized.
Yes.
Extremely organized. Paul has always been that way. Well, except for, like you were saying, Al, the very beginning, the early tours.
Yeah.
But yeah, and for me, because his catalog is so huge at this point, it's just disappointing to me that he relies too much on the Beatles stuff. I mean, if I had my way, I wouldn't want 5 Beatles songs like he did in '76. But you know, when you consider the fact that his career has spanned now over 50 years, if it was me, I'd say 1/3 Beatles should be in his show. So, but now it's just so it's very heavy on the Beatles stuff, and it's been that way since '89, '90, which I think he was doing because of a reaction, because he always wanted to do those songs. He held off doing it, because he really had to prove himself. In the 70s.
I think he has to do the group stuff more now. I don't think there's any question about that. I don't think he could get away with 2/3 solo. I really don't.
Well,
yeah,
that depends. That depends.
There are certain songs that he absolutely has to do. I mean, he has to do Yesterday. He has to do Hey Jude. He has to do Let It Be. He pretty much has to do Long and Winding Road. And
I think he could live without that one, but
me too.
That's just
well, the thing is, you can live without it, but the person who's going to see him for the first time, and this is what he constantly talks about. In fact, he talks about it in this interview from last week. The person that's going to see him for the first time, if he doesn't do Let It Be, that person is going to be very disappointed.
I agree about Let It Be, but I don't think Long and Winding Road follows in the same track.
Well, I don't agree with you, Steve. I think that song is one of his greatest songs ever, The Long and Winding Road.
Yeah.
I keep thinking of the Phil Spector choir in the background.
I've never had a problem with that.
Neither have I.
Really?
Yeah, going back to when it was first released in '70. I thought, in fact, I forget whether it was Spector or somebody else said that they felt that it was, that it was an absolute, since at that point the feeling was that was going to be the last Beatles record released in America. It was almost as if it was like the perfect punctuation mark on their career.
And that's something that we've said here, and I think, Al, you brought it up. So many people complain about The Long and Winding Road, and Phil Spector destroyed it and all that. Nobody complains about Good Night.
Yeah.
And, George Martin did the orchestration for that. That was heavy orchestration on that song.
Yeah, but if John was touring as much as Paul's touring, you wouldn't see Good Night every single time he goes out on tour. You probably would see it like never.
But that has nothing to do with whether or not we like the song or not.
Well,
You don't see Ringo playing Good Night.
No.
That's the only. He doesn't do slow songs, if you notice. He never does Only You. That's the only.
Right, he's never done Only 10. You, and that was
top 10. That's the only top 10 single he's had in the U.S. that he's never done live. He stays away from the ballady stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, but
maybe you should try it.
Anyway, we were just alluding to an interview that Paul McCartney just gave on BBC television. It was at Maida Vale Studios, and John Wilson was the host of this show. It's called Mastertapes. And I would highly recommend, I actually enjoyed this interview. You can watch it, at least the last time I checked Paul McCartney's website, you can actually bring it up, although it's not the complete interview. But he talks about a variety of subjects, which we're going to tackle here on the show. And actually, since we were just discussing this whole idea about Paul and the material that he does live, it was brought up to him. In the audience, Paul Weller was there. Paul Weller from the Jam and the Style Council. And he was saying to Paul, does it bother you at all that a lot of people seem to want to only hear the Beatles stuff and not as much the solo music? And Paul did say, yes, it does bother me. And then the host, John Wilson, said to Paul Weller, because you, meaning Paul Weller, you don't play all your old jam and style council stuff. And then Paul Weller, very interestingly, said that's why I'm not playing stadiums. So, the thing is, when Paul says this, it really bothers me because he's in total control as to what he does live. He decides whether he's going to play stadiums, whether he's going to play smaller venues. That's up to him. He can play solo music if he wants to. If he does either, he has to alert the fans before the tour that that's what he's going to do. If he wants it to be all solo or mainly solo, or he plays smaller venues where he's going to sell out. That's up to him. He's the one that's choosing to play big venues like stadiums or 20,000 seat arenas. He's the one doing that. And he knows that if he's going to play big audiences like that, for that kind of an audience, you got to do Yesterday and Hey Jude and Let It Be and Live and Let Die and those songs.
Exactly.
But he determines himself. It's all in it's his decision. Paul doesn't control what radio stations play, but he sure can control what he does. So for him to complain about it, I can't really sympathize with him. He's the one, he's in the driver's seat here.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I don't know. He seemed to say that he might play things on certain nights because he wants to play them. I mean, that's one of the things he said in that interview. So
yeah, I think he gets a kick out of reviving some old Beatles song that he's never played since they did it. And you get that impression, from his introduction sometimes. Getting better or whatever when he revived that. And I think those things are always the surprising things that people talk about. I mean, this year, Hard Day's Night. I don't think it's that great a version of Hard Day's Night, frankly. I've heard it now from a number of cities, and it's kind of tepid. But the idea of him doing Hard Day's Night, I thought was kind of interesting,
And to open his concert with it.
Yeah.
That's a great opening song, too.
Yeah. I think he may on some level recognize, I know Ken is going to not agree, but that this catalog is actually the best stuff that he was involved in writing. And, look, Dylan says the same thing, too.
Paul feels, and I don't know if Paul will ever fully admit it.
I don't know. I think he's alluded to that over the years. He kind of intimates that he feels that his prime writing was the Beatles catalog and not the post Beatles. Even though there's great stuff. Obviously, in 46 years, he's done a lot of great music. But I think he feels that the Beatles catalog, especially his songs, are something special.
You know what I'd like to see him do that I think could be a really good compromise? You could play a bunch of Beatles songs and play a bunch of Wings and catalog songs, but the guy does a show that is nearly 3 hours long. He could take 45 minutes and do one of his albums start to finish, one of his solo albums. I think that would be really interesting to see.
Yeah,
Stones have done it.
I think he's been asked about that, and
he said no, he wouldn't do it.
Right. Yeah,
he just missed the idea, which I agree. I think it would be nice too, and it'd be.
I think to him, if you do something like that, it's very predictable what you're going to hear from song to song. I think he likes surprising people, even though so many of the fans know what he's going to do anyway when they go to the show.
Yeah.
But what happens is you end up getting deep cuts that you don't hear very often.
Right. I mean, Bruce Springsteen has been out for much of this year doing a 2-disc set, that he released in 1980 called The River, which is, maybe one of the 2 or 3 finest albums he ever released. But it is a two record set. And so there's a lot of music in there. And that's, and that takes up probably 2/3 of his show right now.
I mean, just going through some of the past McCartney DVDs, I listened to him do Fine Line. I listened to him do Sgt. Pepper. Jenny Wren. I mean, and I know, Ken, you've talked about Jenny Wren before. Just the fact that he hasn't, that he doesn't do stuff like that very often, to revive it would be would be fun. I think what he's afraid of is that I think he's gotten too used to digging himself into a kind of a ditch where he just doesn't want to. It's almost like what Ringo's doing, is just doing the same stuff every night. In fact, I notice now he's only changing one song a night. It used to be two or three. It's not even that anymore. So, it's really gotten to the point where he's just making very few changes now.
Yeah, well, there's one thing I wanted to bring up here, because Paul has commented that he notices when he does certain solo songs that people either get up and go to the bathroom then,
right? Or
how was it phrased in this interview, that their tablets went black?
A black hole. That he mentioned that when the Beatles songs are playing, you can see all of the the iPhones all over the stadium. But then when he does one of the the lesser known songs, it's as he called it, a black hole.
Well, what Paul doesn't seem to understand is, if it gets that kind of a reaction, it doesn't necessarily mean that the whole audience hates the song or doesn't like the song. It has more to do with they're not familiar with it. So if you're going to see any artist perform on stage and you need to go to the bathroom, are you going to go during a song that you know and love, or are you going to go during a song that you don't know at all? Yeah. So I think he reacts to that.
I think there are very few McCartney songs that people don't know. I think he's basically put himself on that hill by relying so heavily on Beatles songs.
I agree.
If you stop relying on Beatles songs in the set and put a few more solo songs, then people are gonna. Not only will people, I shouldn't say people will know them more, because they know them now, But I think it would help him that much more, and it would also make the interest in it. It would. I mean, the spoilers in the sets. We all know. We basically know what he's doing on this tour.
Oh, of course.
Like he's only changing one or two. It looks like right now it's only one song a night. I mean, that's.
Well, some of his tours, he never changed anything at all. I mean, in '93, I don't think even in '89, there were very few changes.
He did exactly the same show. Every
same
night.
pattern
He didn't change a show. Change a set list for the entire tour.
You would think, for the sake of the musicians, he would do that, because I would think the musicians, having not played a concert myself as a musician, but I would think that the musicians, and I mean, look what the Rolling Stones are doing. They're varying their songs on their tour. Although I don't know how many songs that they're adding in. I mean, they were doing. Didn't they do one tour where they were getting internet votes on songs? It seemed to me they did. They were taking internet votes on adding certain songs. I mean, I agree that the Stones are the same in the same.
Yeah, I mean, that's a different thing. And again, sorry to bring up Bruce Springsteen again, but there is this portion of the standard Springsteen show where he'll see people bringing cards, bringing placards into the stadium requesting a certain song, and he'll have his people take those placards and bring them on stage, and he'll basically, it's almost like stump the band, and because a lot of times they're not just Springsteen songs, but they're old 60s pop and soul and rock classics, that kind of thing. So it's it's very different. But it's like Ken was saying before, the fact that Paul chooses to play these large venues, that he plays stadiums, and he knows that the crowd that he's going to draw for these stadium shows, they want Beatles songs.
That's goes without saying.
That's what they want, and that's why that's why the percentage of Beatles songs has done nothing but increase since, going all the way back, as Allan mentioned, to 89, 90.
Mm-hmm.
He's the one who's put himself in
exactly.
And we were just talking about how Paul rarely changes the set list. Look at the Wings Over America tour. With the exception of when it really started in Australia, actually, at the end of 75, and he didn't have the Speed of Sound material.
Right.
Once he played in America, every show was almost the same, except some shows ended with High, 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 and some shows ended with Soily. And that was the only difference.
Right.
The entire tour. So he was that way then. He's pretty much the same way now. He only has made a few changes here and there. In the last few years, I've been surprised that if you go to 2 shows in a row, there might be 2 different songs that he flip-flops. But, for the most part, it's pretty much the same. But I also want to just go back to a comment that we were just talking about here about Paul and what he thinks of his material and whether or not his Beatles stuff is his strongest. If it's one thing Paul has done is to avoid assessing his career. Anytime somebody has ever asked him, what's your best album? He'll always say, that's not for me to decide. That's for you guys to decide. It's like a cop-out for him. He'll never really, truly tell you. He'll say he likes the first album, the first McCartney album. He'll call it a funky album, and he'll remember, all the emotion that went on and the turmoil in his life and how he had to turn his life around during the McCartney album and all that. But he doesn't really take a look at his entire solo catalog and tell you, well, I think Tug of War is my best album, or I think Flowers in the Dirt is my best. You'll never hear Paul ever talk about that. You know that he has enormous pride in the Beatles, but I've never heard him say, well, my Beatles stuff is definitely my best, because maybe privately he feels that there are certain albums of his or certain songs of his that just haven't been recognized, and he's too afraid to even say anything about it. You don't know, really. That's why I wish, although it probably would never happen, I'd like to see Paul just give a concert and do whatever he wants and not care what the audience wants. Just what's in his heart at the moment. Yeah, that's just not him. But you don't really know how Paul feels about his entire career. Remember, we were commenting about Wildlife, and in one interview recently, he said it was the worst album he ever made. And then you go back to the McCartney interview that came out in 1980 on vinyl, that album, that interview with Paul Gambaccini. He was remembering how somebody he saw driving by rolled down the window and showed Wildlife and said, best album you ever made, man. So he's bringing that up to show that other people have different opinions, and, everybody's opinions need to be recognized.
I disagree with you that he doesn't know. I think he knows darn well that the Beatles stuff is the best stuff he's ever done. Look at how much he talks about it.
Well, he talks about it because everybody asks him questions about the Beatles. If his interviews were more controlled, then maybe he'd talk about other stuff.
If his interviews were more controlled? I can't imagine anyone giving more controlled interviews than he does.
Yeah, right. And Allan would know better than certainly better than any of the 4 of us.
Then how is he bombarded with so many Beatle questions, and he allows it?
Yeah, well, he is, but you know what? He
even says he loves talking about the Beatles now.
Right.
So he's inviting it.
Yeah, it's funny. It's very hard because he's been asked so much. It's really hard to ask him stuff that is not going to elicit the same group of answers. And I know of one recent interview when he did his ballet, and he was interviewed for the Times by Dan Waken. And it was kind of interesting because Dan asked him something specifically about the ballet and what sort of subplots were going on in it, or, things like that. And he said, I'm sorry, I haven't prepared an answer for that. And I kind of, when I interviewed him in 1990, I worked really hard to not ask the same questions. I mean, I wanted to get out of that room without him telling me he dreamed yesterday. And I did it. And, and I thought we had a really interesting talk with, some stuff that he hasn't talked about in other interviews, just because the way the discussion went, and he answered them, off the cuff. And I thought that was great, but now it's down to, first of all, interviews now, with the exception of things like this BBC interview, which in its full version runs about an hour. Now, when you want to do an interview with him, it's 20 minutes, and it doesn't really matter what venue you're writing for. And from my point of view, 20 minutes is an announcement. It's not an interview, really. And you run into things where if you deviate from the questions he expects, he's not going to wing it, as they say. He's going to tell you he doesn't have an answer prepared, which is very weird. Not only that, it was, he didn't have an answer prepared about the ballet that he was being interviewed about. I didn't really understand that. The only one thing I did say, when I was standing there when Dan was interviewing him, and I said to the person at the desk in front of him, I said, he's going to tell Dan that the New York Times panned Sgt. Pepper, which is only partially true, by the way. And Dan got off the phone, and I said, so did he tell you that the New York Times banned Sgt. Pepper? And he said, he did. That was a surprise. And he said, and then that's when he told me about I haven't prepared an answer for that, because he'd never run into someone who had said that as an answer. So yeah, his interviews are real controlled. That was the point. We've sort of gone astray a bit. But another thing we were all talking about before with that BBC interview was the big headline that has been out there is that he says supposedly in this interview that Wings was terrible. And you all heard the interview. He didn't really say that, right?
No, he did. That was an off the cuff.
Yeah, I never heard those three words.
No,
in the interview.
He was talking about when they first got together.
It was great. Is what he said.
Yeah,
and that's where people expanded that comment to say, stretched it out and made it, Wings was terrible. No. That's not what he. Yeah. I mean, he was basically saying, they were thrown together, which is what we've all said.
And he said we weren't very good, but he's talking about a really, really specific period at the very beginning of Wings when they'd had 3 rehearsals and went out and played at colleges. Okay, they weren't great. I mean, we've all heard the tapes.
Sure.
But they were fun, they were energetic. It wasn't a bad band. And certainly by the time you get to the album we've been discussing, you can't say that he would have thought that was a terrible band, or really anybody would have. It's, it's kind of crazy, but it's this is what I would, I'm sure Steve feels the same way. I mean, we spent our lives as journalists, and to see, that journalism has gotten to the level where you can take a quote like that in the context he gave it and turn it into a headline in respectable newspapers, British ones. So Paul says Wings was terrible. It's
well. If we're saying are we saying the Daily Mail is a respectable newspaper?
I thought it was in the Telegraph, wasn't it?
No, I thought
was it the Telegraph? Was it the Telegraph or the Guardian?
Or the Guardian? It was one of those.
I think it was the Guardian has their own troubles these days.
Yeah.
With a new a new owner and a new editor and all, but so it's possible that they're kind of going the way of the Fleet Street tabloid papers.
Yeah. I don't know. When I was a kid, and probably when Steve was a kid, the idea that you were supposed to sort of write something that would illustrate the reality.
Sure.
It's getting really ridiculous now. I mean, the way stories have been pulled out of. I mean, and not just McCartney. I mean, it's everybody, and it's crazy. And when I see stories like this, Wings were a horrible band, I just kind of, go, oh my God, please, and you almost know what really gets people's attention is the element of surprise. If it's something that they haven't heard before, they don't give a damn if it's true. And especially, this is especially true in politics, if it's somebody they think they agree with, or they, they'll pull, look at the current, if I can go off on politics a little bit, look at the current political campaign, the way things are getting tossed around about the two candidates, one in particular who I won't be partisan, but those of you that know me know who I'm talking about. It's ridiculous. It's crazy. It's stupid, and that's what has happened. And that's the way.
Okay, ridiculous, crazy, and stupid. Give me an idea who you're talking.
Let's see. How about if I say orange? Does that give you a
Okay,
clue?
yeah.
Okay. So.
But yes, it's silly. And the way not only with politics, but it's celebrity news is stupid.
Yeah.
I almost feel, I think I actually mentioned this to Patty Boyd when I talked to her. I said, I asked her, we were talking casually, and I said, how do you guys feel about all of these crazy stories? And she goes, God, it's ridiculous. It really is. You almost have to feel sorry for celebrity. I don't know, Allan, if you do, but in a way I do feel kind of sorry for some of the stories that come out that get reported. It's stupid.
Yeah, I think so too.
Well, the media jumps on anything that's outrageous. That's said.
Right.
It's only done to get ratings, to get people talking about it, to bring in more ratings. It's more about making money.
Yeah, but
And
in
especially-
this
and
case,
especially-
there was nothing outrageous. He didn't say anything outrageous. It just
No.
sort of.
Oh, in
got
this case, he
ratings.
didn't. No. Unfortunately, when I've seen the response to this on Facebook and I've read some of the threads, some people are smart enough to realize this was taken out of context.
Yeah.
And then there are other people who are stupid who would say, "Yeah, Wings really was terrible."
This is
There's no
my pet peeve is social media, and the way the amount of stupidity that is out there on social media, on Facebook, on Twitter, on Instagram, whatever. There is so much. There should be, I don't know. I think there should be an intelligence exam for anybody who wants to register with one of these sites, because there's an awful lot of stupidity out there, and it's dangerous stupidity, especially all these people that have been getting into have been throwing around politics, and people that are that go on there and bully their schoolmates and all this stuff. It's something eventually has got to be done. And in fact, from that same interview with Paul, the other sort of newsy nugget was about his defense of Kanye West, and about especially the All Day song, and his labeling Oprah as being more conservative and all. And I saw some of the reaction on on Facebook, and these people are they're clueless. They're absolutely clueless. They don't have if they have a brain in their head, they've never used it. It's and they just get on there to spew hot air. It's absolutely ridiculous. End of rant.
We've had our
We've all
Altaconquer
ranted.
moment for this episode.
Yes.
That's true.
But I wanted to touch upon a couple of things here, because one of the things that I found interesting about the interview, watching it, and again, it's a different experience to me watching this interview than just listening to it, because he did bring up the Beatle breakup and how difficult it was for him at the time, not just for the breakup, but for him to actually sue the other Beatles in order to free himself from Allan Klein. And the thing is that when you actually watch this interview, and by the way, Paul doesn't have much makeup on, if any, and he really looks a lot older here.
Yeah.
And I'm very, very concerned about his voice, even his speaking voice, which has been hoarse for years. And even when he attempts to try and sing something here,
Yeah.
It's really not that good. And it takes a lot for me to say that, by the way.
Mhm.
But when he talks about the when he talks about the Beatle breakup here, you can tell it still gets to him. It's still a very emotional thing. It's like it still torments him, this whole thing that he had to sue the other Beatles. And you can see it in his face. And this is the kind of thing that if you just listen to the audio, you probably won't pick up at all. But I found that to be really interesting. It's so many years later. But, you know, this is so much a part of his life and how it turned out. And it was such a, you know, a turning event in his life. And it still is something that he has difficulty wrestling with, you know, that whole episode of having to sue the other Beatles. And it just goes to show you how human he is.
Yeah, by the way, since we're pointing people to videos on the internet, I ran into one just the other day that was a 1973 interview that John Lennon gave in L.A., I think for a program called Weekend or Weekday or who knows, something like that. I mean, very easy to find on YouTube, where he had just freed himself from Allan Klein. And in this interview, he says, you know, Paul might have been right. He just uses those words. Paul might have been right about Klein. So.
Yeah. And as a matter of fact, even as we've been talking, I just happened to popped up in my email was the monthly Paul McCartney What's That You're Doing e-newsletter, if you want to call it that. And in fact, in there is a link to the BBC interview, the video version.
Okay.
So
I would recommend everyone to watch it because I still found it interesting, even though it's territory that we've heard before. Not everyone's heard these same stories. You can't just assume we all have heard them, but it still is an interesting interview. He tackles a lot of ground in here. So
there was some new stuff. The new stuff about Kanye, actually, and Rihanna working, how those tracks were made. That was something I hadn't heard about before. And
that's true. I didn't know about the fact that they had, you know, sped up his voice particularly.
Right. That was interesting, and because everybody wondered where he was in there, and nobody figured that out, as I recall.
Yeah.
I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, here's a quote. I actually have the quote from Paul about Kanye, about All Day. He said, "It's a great record. Sonically, it's brilliant. But quite a few people said, you can't be connected to this. There's like 40 N-words." And then he says, "I love Kanye and he loves me. He's a monster. He's a crazy guy who comes up with great stuff. So he inspires me." So I think this just shows that Paul is a bit open-minded to having people do whatever they feel like with his music. And you also know this from all the remixes that have been done with his stuff. So
I think it was more of an experiment. Actually, I don't think it was. I thought he wanted to just throw it out there and see what the reaction would be. I don't think he really knew what people were going to say, and the reaction, I mean, was pretty strong, and a lot of it was very negative. So I don't know. Be interesting to see if he continues that.
We shall see. All right, one final question, since we touched on this a bit here in this show. Since we were talking about Wings, do you honestly think of them as a group effort, or will you always think that it's Paul and his backup band? Because, like we've been saying, he did make a sincere effort for members of the group to have their time on stage, even to be interviewed. So it wasn't as if from the very beginning he said, "This is my band, it's all my songs," because it wasn't that way. So, Allan, how about you?
Well, I think I already spent considerable time waffling about that. I'm not sure I can come up with any more definitive answer. You know, you want to think of it as a band, but you know that it basically was Paul and a bunch of employees, really, who he allowed to sing a song each, and but basically it was his show, which it was going to have to be no matter what. I think they tried to make it into a band. You know, I think he wanted it to be a band at some point, you know, but he also wanted it to be the way he wanted it. So it was a band, but it wasn't a democracy, you know, and I think in the end it was something less than a band in the way that the Beatles or Led Zeppelin or the Stones are a band.
Mm.
Okay. Al?
Have to agree with Allan to a great extent, but if there is a period in the Wings saga where they at least gave the illusion of being a band as such, it would be that period in 75 and 76, the version of the band with Denny Lane and Jimmy McCulloch and Joe English, and perhaps even before him Jeff Britton. That version of the band, that was really the one that gave at least the illusion of being a real functioning band. Before that, and even the version with Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley, with all due respect to those two heavyweights, to musical heavyweights, that version of Wings was definitely simply a backup band for Paul. You know, they were not a band.
Well,
which was why he was able to jettison them so easily after the Japan bust and all.
Well, I know for a fact you won't get Lawrence Juber to agree with what you just said.
That's true.
Of course he would.
Based on a lot of things that he said about all of his contributions, Lawrence's contributions to the songs on Back to the Egg, in particular, Lawrence wouldn't agree with that. Okay, Steve, how about you?
I think they're actually probably a little more of a group than Al and Allan do. I agree that there was a lot. I mean, Paul basically, a lot of his musicians are musicians for hire, but I think looking back, I don't know if you could have said this back then, but I think now you have to agree that Wings was more of a band than I don't know. It wasn't like, I'm trying to think of an example, such and such and the rimtones or whatever. I don't know, but I mean it wasn't like that. It definitely wasn't like that. I do think that the current group is more of a band than some of his other bands. I think he's got a lot of trust in them now. I mean, it's funny. I was again watching some of the old DVDs. Those guys never talk, never introduce songs. Unlike Denny Lane introducing,
and in fact, Paul doesn't even introduce them anymore. He just says at the end of the show, he says, "And isn't this a great band?"
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it. He doesn't introduce them.
Right. Which is which for that one person that is seeing him for the first time, they might like to know who those guys on stage are. Yeah, that's kind of weird that he doesn't.
So that's certainly not a band, in that respect. It's just simply they're his hired backups.
Well, I think that they put in enough effort that you have to give them a little more than that.
Well, yeah, they're very professional.
Right.
They're very professional, and they do their job well, but they're not, they don't even give the illusion of being sort of equals to him. They're simply up there to back him up.
Well, I think there's no way they can be equals to him. I mean, that's just not going to happen. Right.
But I mean, he even gave, but like Ken's point was that or Allan's point, I think more so, was that in the mid 70s, Paul gave the illusion that Wings was more of a functioning band.
Mm-hmm. I would never use the word illusion. I think that you're misappropriating.
Oh, right. Yeah. No, it was really more Allan and my opinion. But this band, they're simply his backup band, and there's nothing wrong with it. But they're not. They shouldn't be compared, say, to Wings, because they're not. There's not even the thought of them being a real band. I mean, they've hardly even been on any of his records, except for the last album, except for New, they've hardly been on any of his records since they began backing him up. and that's been 15, almost 15 years.
And that says something right there. I mean, they were on half of Memory Almost Full. I'm trying to remember about Chaos and Creation. There's only a few of them, I think, that played on Chaos and Creation and not on every song.
Right.
So there's a huge difference right there. I do think that Paul deserves credit for trying to establish Wings as a band. And I think he really did try, not only on his albums, and I can't overemphasize Wings at the Speed of Sound enough, because to have every member sing lead doesn't happen that often, you know, aside from the Beatles. How many other groups can you think of where every member took a lead vocal? So to do that, that was very consciously done. It wasn't just an accident. And the mere fact that if you went to the Wings Over America tour, you had 5 songs that Denny Lane sang lead to. 5. That's actually quite a lot, I think. And then Jimmy McCullough got Medicine Jar in there. So I really think that he wanted Wings to be established as a band. But what happened was the 4th and 5th members kept leaving. So that really made it difficult to keep the same lineup and, you know, to really, you know, define the same group of people as a band. And I think once Jimmy and Joe left, the air went out of the bag, sort of, in a way. And then Paul would have to pick up the pieces again and then get another 4th and 5th member. And I do love that last lineup, Lawrence and Steve. I think they're tremendous musicians. And that's another band I would have loved to have seen that lineup continue. In fact, you know, I'm listening back to an interview I did several years ago with Denny Lane talking about it was very frustrating to see that once they were really getting into that last lineup of Wings and they were getting better and better as a band and getting better live, then the breakup happened. So it's like he's building up the bands, they're doing a great job, and then something happens and the 4th and 5th members leave. So because of that, it made it very difficult. There was no consistency with the same lineup for a long period of time. You know, at least when you're talking about a band like, say, Fleetwood Mac, once you have those 5 members that you know of as Fleetwood Mac, they stay that way for a long time. It wasn't like that with Wings. And
I'm not sure if Fleetwood Mac is the best example.
Well, I think when most people think of Fleetwood Mac, they think of the Rumors, you know, Fleetwood Mac. Yeah. But and so people tend to think of that. Well, you know, they all made a massive contribution to the group and had many lead vocalists, and many of them wrote their own songs, as you well know. Yeah. So more like that. That's more of a band, the Eagles, you know, with more input in terms of songwriting and all that. There was some of that in Wings. In fact, when you get to London Town, there's 5 songs that Paul and Denny wrote together. So there was a lot there in the work relationship, but not enough and not consistently enough for a long period of time to have this hardened image of what Wings is. And also, one other thing that people tend to overlook is that every hit song that Wings had was the Paul vocal. So, you know, if you had Denny Lane with Time to Hide being a hit, you know, people might have had a different impression of the group. Or if Medicine Jar was a hit, you know, a hit single, something like that, but they were all Paul hits. They were all Paul vocals and Paul's compositions. So it certainly appeared as though it was Paul's band. But Paul really tried to make Wings work and to give attention to all the members. And I think he deserves a lot of attention for it. But for these reasons, I think that, Wings didn't work out the way that Paul wanted it to. And once the 80s came into play and he was starting to work on McCartney 2, it was time to let it go. So that's my impression of Wings. I don't know if you guys agree.
I don't. we were all so intently listening. I still don't see. I mean, like I said, I think Wings was a group, but I think you'd almost have to put quotation marks around that to a certain extent because of just because of who Paul is. I mean, can we ever envision Paul working equally with a band, like in a band like that, unless it was, unless he formed a Traveling Wilburys thing, and even then, he probably wouldn't have done that. That would have been an interesting situation if he had tried to do that.
Well, except that he didn't really travel in like musical circles in the way that either John or certainly George did. Like I said earlier, the guys in the Traveling Mulberries were all personal friends of George's. I mean, Roy Orbison going all the way back to one of the first Beatles tours.
Right.
Whereas
we pretty much you're right.
Whereas Paul didn't really have any kind of like peers that he really kind of hung out with.
Mm-hmm. Well,
that's part of the problem. If you're in a band with Paul McCartney, most people are going to think that he's the leader, no matter what, no matter who you have in the group.
Yeah.
So you have that inherent problem when you're forming a group like that. So
right, when Bob Dylan is in your group, you're not gonna take on airs and say I'm the leader of the group.
He tried it a little with Rockestra in a way. He had Pete Townsend, and John Bonham,
that's true.
And he did work with Elvis Costello, but yeah. I don't know who he would. Maybe this could be another show. Well, didn't we do a show that was a little bit about...
We did, yes.
Yeah, I thought I was there. Okay.
All right, we covered a lot of ground here on the show this time out. So, if any of you would like to get in contact with us, we do have an email address. It's thingswesaidtodayradioshow@gmail.com. We have our own Facebook page at Things We Said Today. We have our own Twitter account, which I never remember. Steve?
Things We Said Fab with the @ sign in front of it.
And if people want to get in touch with you, Steve, they can do so how?
Email me at BeatlesExaminer@gmail.com. I have a personal Facebook page. I have a Beatles news group called Beatles News and Commentary that you're all welcome to join. And we can talk about anything and everything regarding the Beatles and what's happening every day, and that's where you can catch me.
Okay, Al, how about you?
Facebook at Al Sussman, where I don't do anything personal. I just do because there's too many nuts on Facebook. Same with Twitter, and Twitter is at ASUSS49, or you can contact me through Beatle Fan Magazine, www.beatlefan.com, or www.paradingpress.com.
And Allan?
Probably also through the dreaded social media, Facebook. Send me a Facebook message at Allan Kozin or Allan Kozin Remixed, and I see those pretty regularly.
And as for me, Ken Michaels, my email address is everylittlething@att.net. I also have a Facebook page under Ken Michaels, and I have my own website, kenmichaelsradio.com, which has Beatles trivia every single week, and I do have a brand new special contest, which as this gets posted, will soon be starting, and that's to win 3 CDs from a gentleman that all of us are familiar with, and that's Jeff Slate, who has just put out a brand new CD called Secret Poetry. He's worked with a lot of people connected with the Beatles, and on the new CD, he's got, well, we just mentioned Lawrence Juber and Steve Holley on there. Also members of Elephant's Memory, Gary Van Sciak and Adam Ippolito. And I have his 3 most recent CDs, which you can win all in one package, a triple shot of Jeff Slate CDs. Find out how at kenmichaelsradio.com. All right, this has been fun, all this talk about Wings. And thanks so much for joining us for Things We Said Today. This is Ken Michaels being joined by Steve Marinucci, Al Sussman, and Allan Kozin. Thanking all of you for listening, and we will see you next time.